Welcome to Uncommon Sense, where we do our best to make it common again. I'm your host, Adrian Alquist, and today I am joined with yet another person who is featured in My Name is Lazarus, Carl Olson. Carl, how are you?
Good, thanks, Adrian. Nice to be with you.
Nice to be with you too. Carl is also the editor of the Catholic World Report, which we're big fans of because it publishes my dad's articles from time to time, right?
Yeah,
yeah.
happily.
You just published one, right? It was on Thomas Howard.
It was great. Yeah, because Thomas Howard, of course, had such a profound influence on a lot of evangelicals, such as your father, such as myself. Your father and I have a kind of similar background, even though he's a little bit older. And Thomas Howard's works and journey and testimony were really helpful to a lot of people. And of course, he obviously knew Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams. Your father writes about that in that piece. In fact, I learned a couple of different things in there I didn't really know about Thomas Howard's work regarding Charles Williams, even though I have his book on Charles Williams. But yeah, a great man. Thomas Howard died at the age of 85, and wrote, I think, Peter Kreeft had a piece for us too. And Peter Kreeft made this interesting remark. He said, Tom wrote maybe about 12 books, he said, but they were all masterpieces.
Cool.
It's effusive, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. Thomas Howard was really one of the great stylists, and unlike some stylists, he had great substance. He had both. And
cool. Yeah. And so that's awesome. I didn't know that. And if you want to know more, I'll put a link to my dad's article in the description on YouTube. And I'll put a link to the Catholic World Report in general. It'll take you to the Catholic World Report, right?
Yep.
Yeah, perfect. Cool. Yeah. And I'll also, obviously, I'll always have a link to My Name is Lazarus, where you should pick it up at our shop. So yeah, let's get into it. Tell us what your deal is. What is the conversion story? Yeah.
Well, Chesterton. So I discovered Chesterton in the mid 90s. So my wife and I entered the Catholic Church in 1997, and really for about 3 years, we were married in 1994, and really right around the time, not too long after we became married, was when we really began to look at the Catholic Church, especially in that first year of our marriage. And there were a variety of reasons for that. Both Heather and I had attended evangelical Bible colleges and had that background, but I had never really heard of Chesterton. I mean, I think I'd certainly heard the name, but I'd not read him. And actually, the first thing I read by him was a man called Thursday.
The Man Who Was Thursday, yeah.
Yeah, Man Who Was Thursday. I always get the title wrong, and I know as soon as I say it, I get the title wrong.
No, that's okay. It's the 100-year anniversary this year. That's why it's on the tip of my tongue.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I read that novel and I liked it, but it wasn't like there was any. I mean, I really enjoyed it, but it was when I read Orthodoxy, that's when I really connected with Chesterton, because
classic.
It's a classic, and it's a classic for good reason. But I think it was perfect for me, as it is for a lot of people. A lot of people, cite it as an influence for a number of reasons. Certainly his approach to paradox, his very winsome approach to just addressing kind of falsehoods about Christianity in general. But I think the big thing, and I talk about this in this compilation, My Name is Lazarus, is the joyfulness. Now, part of this is because my own personality being kind of Scandinavian, having a little bit more melancholy kind of personality maybe. Chesterton's joy, his joyful approach to the faith, and not just defending the faith, but living the faith, knowing the faith, really captured me. It was really a great, I want to call it an antidote, but it was something that I think I really needed at that time. I certainly read a lot of C.S. Lewis. I'd read a lot of T.S. Eliot. Of course, T.S. Eliot is kind of melancholy. It's not, effusive or joyful in nature, even though I continue to love the writing of T.S. Eliot. Of course, he wasn't an apologist. But Chesterton's orthodoxy, and then in short order, I started going through all of them, The Thing, Everlasting Man, books on St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Francis of Assisi, read a lot of Chesterton. It was about a year where along with Newman, some Aquinas, church fathers, John Paul II, I was reading a lot of Chesterton, and he certainly played a huge, huge role in us eventually becoming Catholic. I mean, my running joke was that when I was eventually asked later to give, some talks on becoming Catholic, my joke was, Catholics get criticized for maybe not evangelizing or defending their faith. And I said, when I was looking at the Catholic Church, I met all these Catholics who were constantly defending and explaining the faith. I said, now they're all dead. They were all they were all dead maybe decades ago, and of course that's not totally true. But the point there was, you have this communion of saints. I mean, if you're reading Ignatius of Antioch, if you're reading St. Thomas Aquinas, Chesterton, whoever it is, you really are stepping into a company of those who are very much alive, right?
Yeah. I like how you mentioned that the joyful aspect was a big component. I remember we had Brandon Vaught on the podcast, and he said that a lot of people are drawn to his joyfulness, Chesterton's joyfulness. And yeah, it makes sense. I mean, the best way to evangelize is to live the faith, and the virtue of joy is a big component to that, right?
Yeah, I think it speaks to some things that a lot of people note about Chesterton, rightfully so, and that his great sense of charity. He was not, even when he was very critical, even when he was very strong in his criticisms, there was a real spirit of charity. Obviously, he's really famous for his relationships with people like H.G. Wells and others who were atheists or skeptics. Shaw, right? George Bernard Shaw. So he was able to have those relationships and do it in a way that really is so contrary, right, to the kind of thing that we see now, especially with social media, where everybody just immediately it's like the wolves descending, and it's just, if you slip up, even if it's even people from your own quote unquote tribe will go after you if you don't say
right. And it's like it's interesting because it seems like the closest thing we have to role models, at least in our society, are people, at least in stories, the Byronic hero. That's what it would be called, like Batman and stuff. The very,
right,
growly and serious people. Those are a lot, like we see that all the time in our stories now, right? And that's not a bad thing necessarily, but it's just I think Chesterton might say at a certain point that seriousness is not a virtue. I might be confusing Chesterton with our family dinner table conversations, but seriousness is not necessarily a virtue. It's not a bad thing, but it's the virtue of joy that is the difficult thing to embody, right?
Yeah, there's a great quote from Chesterton, and unlike your father, I can't quote reams of Chesterton off the top of my head.
I know.
Chesterton had some great comments about those who don't take themselves seriously, those who are the lightness of being, right? And he's not talking.
Actually, my favorite Chesterton quote is "Angels can fly because they take themselves lightly." And right. I know I got one word in that wrong because it's always quoted wrong on social media, and it's like one word difference. But whatever it is, look up the original quote, and maybe someone put it in the description, because that I really like that quote.
Yeah, and it kind of is it goes along with the flip side, where in Orthodoxy, Chesterton talks about the maniac, right? Mm-hmm. Who is so obsessed with one thing that he essentially loses his mind. That he talks about the rationalist and the maniac as being kind of essentially the same person, because there's a monomania. And I think this, it's really funny because Chesterton, as you well know, and people who read Chesterton know, Chesterton kind of fell out of favor for a long time after his death, because, and one of the reasons was people looked at his emphasis on paradox and they'd say, oh, he's just flippant. He's just trying to be clever and cute or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but this might be the only time I can mention one of your lines in My Name is Lazarus. I was pulling it up earlier, and you said he did so with a feast of joy. He did show the mystery of the faith and stuff, so palpable that some of his critics mistake it for flippancy or glibness.
Yeah,
that's kind of what you're talking about right now.
It's a huge point. It's a huge point for me because I don't think that Chesterton was infallible, but I think that the criticisms that are leveled against him sometimes are so, I have to laugh at some of them. And but this was a big one. This was one that, and you might be familiar with it was kind of a obscure book published in the, let's see, 1952 or so. Hugh Kenner, who went on to become, a great poetic critic.
Oh, actually, I shouldn't be nodding my head because I'm not familiar with this person.
Well, Hugh Kenner, who died, gosh, I want to say maybe 7-8 years ago, went on to write books on Pound and Yeats and so forth.
Okay.
But he wrote, he's Catholic, he wrote a book at the age of 24 for Sheed & Ward called Paradox in Chesterton. And I was fortunate enough to actually discover for free a copy of this book, which at the time was selling, it was out of print, selling for like $200 a copy. I found a copy of it. It's just an absolutely brilliant defense of Chesterton back in 52 by a 24-year-old guy, saying that, people don't understand that Chesterton's use of paradox speaks to his metaphysical brilliance. He really gets the nature of being, the nature of the way things are. And he understands paradox because he has such a deep understanding and love for the fact that Christianity is essentially paradoxical. The Trinity is paradoxical. The incarnation is paradoxical. Unfortunately, a lot of people today think a paradox is something that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we know that a paradox is actually where you have two mysteries, if you will. They seemingly on the surface don't seem to go together. One God, three persons, fully God, fully man, etc. And yet, as you begin to dive more deeply into them and contemplate them, you realize that they do go together. And at the same time, you recognize that you can't fully understand them because they are divine mysteries. And yet you can continually work at knowing them more deeply, not just intellectually, but also at a spiritual level, an intuitive level. Right. But what does that require? It requires a number of things, but I would say two of those things are humility and gratitude. And unfortunately, I mentioned this social media, which I certainly am out there on Twitter and so forth. Humility and gratitude aren't always the things that come to mind when you're looking at social media. And there are exceptions, by the way. Because I'm kind of being negative here, I'll be positive for a second. You see on Twitter, somebody will say, I have a prayer request or I have a friend who just died or somebody's ill. And you get an outpouring of people who say, I'm praying for you. And so forth. So there are positives to it, but humility and gratitude are essential for approaching paradox. But if there's one thing about kind of the modern mind or the modern lack of mind is the lack of humility and gratitude. So to get back to Kenner just for a quick second, Kenner wrote this really brilliant book. And basically I'm putting it in my words, but basically part of his argument was that Chesterton is like a Thomist who doesn't necessarily write like a Thomist. He obviously did not write in a scholastic fashion. Quite the contrary. He kind of goes all over the place, right?
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was talking to, or with I forget who it was, but it was just on a recent podcast. I said exactly that. I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, but when you really get down to what he's saying, to the content, and to how he argues it, what he's essentially presenting, it's a very deeply Thomistic perspective. And at the heart of that is really, again, this love for what really is, the nature of being. And really, if you look at the modern, postmodern world today, there is such a, I would say, even a demonic hatred for being, for what is. So I think this is why Chesterton is so timely. He gives you, in oftentimes an incredibly quotable, accessible form, the means to understand the world we live in, and then to approach it with the right attitude. Again, the sense of joyfulness, of recognizing that, there's a constant battle, and yet we have an eternal perspective. He brings that all the time to his writing. So that's what, one of the things I really love about his writing, and it obviously emanates from him as a man.
Yeah. That's awesome. And I found another quote actually of you quoting Chesterton, how he was defending the church because it is attacked on all sides for all contradictory reasons. That's kind of what you're actually talking about with Chesterton. He was attacked from all sides, but they didn't amount to anything, because it's especially clear if people are attacking him for opposite reasons. Is he
Yep.
too idealistic? If you're attacking him for being too optimistic or too pessimistic, that doesn't make sense. It can't be both. And that makes you think, oh, maybe he's realistic. Maybe he's practical and he's just speaking the truth.
And he has the whole chapter on orthodoxy on the paradoxes. That chapter really jumped out at me because as a fundamentalist Protestant growing up in a very anti-Catholic setting, we kind of lived in these with these cliches about the Catholic Church. The worshiping the Pope, and of course all the millions.
And Mary being part of the Trinity or something like that.
Worshiping Mary, worshiping the Pope. Even sometimes people would even say that. The tens of millions who were killed by the Catholic Church. I mean, my running joke, this goes back to some fundamentalist things like Tim LaHaye, who I had an email debate with almost 20 years ago, but also with Dan Brown, like in the Da Vinci Code, these really wild accusations that are quite funny when you know the history, and they don't get the paradox of what's going on.
Yeah, that's a good segue actually, because you wrote some stuff about Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, well, the relationship to Chesterton here for me is that I ended up speaking at, I think it was the 2005 Chesterton conference.
Okay.
If I remember correctly.
Which I would have been there as a kid.
15 years ago. I'm in my 50s now. I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was. And I gave a talk on Chesterton and the Da Vinci Code, and I had all these great quotes from Chesterton. But and I won't get them right again off the top of my head. But one thing he does say that I thought was really fascinating. He says that a bad novel tells us a lot, or tells us a great deal about the author. It reveals far more about the author than it reveals about truth. And that really stuck with me because I think there was a lot of truth into that in relationship to Dan Brown. And specifically, Dan Brown, when that book, his novel first came out, a novel which, by the way, sold 80-some million copies.
It's so I haven't read the Da Vinci Code. I don't know much about it. I just know kind of the criticisms of it. Can you give some context for people who don't know about it?
Oh, yeah, for maybe younger people or who have not, or people who just somehow missed it. Which I
that was me. That was kind of
yeah, no, good. Well, of course, it was a novel, but what people were talking about were the claims made in it about early Christianity, Jesus Christ, Mary Magdalene, the Gnostic scriptures. So essentially, it's set up as really covers the course of just a handful of days where there's these mysterious events and murders and so forth that take place in Paris, London, and you have the Robert Langdon, who's the detective, who's a symbologist, which is actually a discipline that apparently doesn't really exist. But he explains symbolism, and so he goes on this search to find out the truth about some things relating to the Holy Grail and so forth. And what he discovers, quote unquote, is that Jesus was just an ordinary dude, right? Just an ordinary guy. But really the key person here was Mary Magdalene, because she's somehow, it's never really explained how, but she's somehow this divine feminine. She embodies a feminine divinity of sorts. It's not really clear.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And yet she's completely reliant upon this ordinary guy, Jesus, who did nothing of consequence in order for her to be who she was. And of course, this ends up being secretly painted in the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. So
I see. Wow.
The key thing for people to recognize is that the novel was pitched. It was promoted heavily, brilliantly, actually. It was a brilliant marketing campaign, as really getting into the truth, even in the form of a novel, into what really went on in the early church and how these secret scriptures were condemned and the church tried to destroy them. The Gospel of Thomas, all these other Gospels, which of course plenty of scholars have been reading them for a long time. They're there. But one of the funniest claims, speaking of kind of a paradox in the novel by the main characters, is that it's in the secret Gnostic scriptures that we have the true Jesus, the true physical flesh and blood Jesus is revealed, and not like the Christian Gospels, where he's just kind of this hovering divine kind of entity, which is all made up by the later Christians. And as of course, as Sandra Miesel, my co-author, and I point out, well, all you have to do to understand how false that is to actually read the four Gospels, and then to read a bunch of the Gnostic scriptures, and recognize that the Gnostic scriptures have nothing to do with a flesh and blood Christ. In fact, the whole point of Gnosticism is to say that the material realm is evil. We need to escape it. It's in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We see the dirt and the grime and the blood and the sweat and the tears, and of course, eventually the passion and the death of Christ. I mean, this is very flesh and blood stuff that's going on in those accounts. So Dan Brown made a big deal about this being based in truth. In fact, he makes the claim that everything regarding the historical documents and persons in the book was heavily researched, completely accurate, etc. And that went on. The New York Times and the Chicago papers and other newspapers saying, "Oh, it's great, so intellectual, so brainy, etc." And then it got exposed for just being really trash. I mean, intellectually, historically, literary, it's just trash. And but it was so popular. I mean, it was a huge phenomenon. It's now just kind of entered the common kind of lexicon of popular culture, right? So Chesterton, wrote so many fascinating things about bad fiction and pulp fiction. He talks about how this really reveals things about the author himself. And of course, he wrote a lot about skeptics and those who try to do away with the authentic Christ and replace him with various forms of Christ. So in my talk at that conference, I drew upon those great quotes from Chesterton to address some of the main errors in the Da Vinci Code. But Dan Brown was a kind of a lapsed Episcopalian. He clearly has for whatever reason, has kind of a strange animosity against the Catholic Church. To give you, and this is from another book, he wrote a book called Angels and Demons, which was actually the precursor to the Da Vinci Code, but then became a bestseller after the success of the Da Vinci Code. He makes the claim, for example, in that novel, his main character does, who basically is speaking as Dan Brown, for Dan Brown, that the Catholic Church got its teachings about transubstantiation, belief of the real presence of the Eucharist, from the Aztecs, which is really interesting because, of course, the Aztecs didn't really exist until long after the Last Supper, et cetera. And then it begs the question of how, it's this kind of stuff.
Right. Okay.
And,
wow.
And the fact that it's taken so seriously,
did Dan Brown really mean it as a commentary of some sort, or was he actually just writing fiction? What, because did the marketers do what Dan Brown wanted them to do?
I think, Sandra Miesel and I had some interesting conversations about this as we were working on our book. At one point, Sandra said, I just wonder if this is all just a scam. Like he basically is doing this but it became really clear as you began to look at, and we looked at every single interview and watched every interview of him that we could, that he never backed off from it. He said, I stand by it, et cetera, et cetera.
Interesting.
But what we showed is actually he borrowed almost all of his material from a couple of other books, conspiracy type books that came out in the 1970s and 80s. And we go through that in the novel. I think the point is, it's really one of the great things about being a Catholic, and you see this in Chesterton's writing, is there's no argument or attack that hasn't been tried already. It's, if you see something and it seems new, you can be guaranteed as a Catholic it's not new. Maybe the verbiage is tweaked. Maybe there's a new spin that people try to put on it. But as Chesterton comes back to this in various ways. You see it in The Everlasting Man, I think. And he talks about the different deaths of the church and different things. How there's really nothing new, essentially, when you get down to really fundamental truths. It's all these different attacks have been leveled before. Gnosticism, of course, really blew up in the 2nd century, so it's been around for a long time. So it's not just comforting; it's more than comforting. It also gives us a real, I think, again, that joyfulness and knowledge that the faith stands on firm foundations, despite the many difficulties and the ups and downs that we see, especially in this year,
Yeah.
2020, which is kind of the epitome of ups and downs, right? So,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, wow, that's really cool. That was cool to talk about your work with the Da Vinci. I think you called it the Da Vinci hoax,
yeah,
right?
the Da Vinci Hoax, which actually that title came from Mark Brumley, the president of Ignatius Press. He came up with that, and
Cool.
I ended up being on a number of interesting shows. By satellite. I was on Geraldo, which is actually pretty funny because it was on satellite. I was up in Portland, Oregon. I get the connection is made. It's going to be a 10-minute segment, and then I find out at that moment live that there's another guest. I thought it was going to be just myself, stupidly,
Wow.
and the
Dang.
other guest was a guy by the name of Jerry Falwell, and of course, very famous evangelical leader of the moral majority, etc. And Jerry Falwell had clearly not read the Da Vinci Code, but that didn't stop him from speaking nonstop for like 9 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So I had 1 minute at the end, and I packed in my whole spiel in 1 minute on Geraldo.
Wow.
Yeah,
Impressive. I feel like you gave a very small
yeah,
snapshot, and you definitely took more than 1 minute this time.
yeah.
That's impressive.
I appreciate you. Yeah, you fortunately did not bring on any of the Falwells, which I appreciate.
Yeah, yeah. Cool. So you've been working as the editor for the Catholic World Report, and I mean, oh, you also worked for Ignatius Press. That's right.
Right.
And so you've been in this Catholic editing world, and
Publishing and editing, yeah.
okay,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. Can you speak about how that's been?
Well, I've been very, very blessed, very fortunate, really, because Heather and I entered the Catholic Church in 1997, and um, as I was by 1990, end of 1995 or so. I think I was ready to become Catholic, and Heather said, I think we should take a little longer. We should, maybe go and meet some people. And it turns out we were living right across from St. Paul's Catholic Church here in Eugene, Oregon.
Hmm.
So I finally went over and I introduced myself. I met the RCIA director, Marie Barischer, who was fantastic. And then we met the priest, Father Tim Kaitis, who's wonderful. And we went through RCIA, and you hear sometimes horror stories about RCIA,
Oh yeah,
unfortunately. Ours was complete opposite. It was fantastic. It was scripture. It was tradition. It was catechism. It was wonderful, and we met incredible people.
that's awesome
And,
because Kevin O'Brien is also, he tells a story. My name is Lazarus, and he says the same thing. He's like, "Well, it was great." So that's good
and
to
I,
hear. That's good anecdotes. Yeah.
yeah, and I met even people around the time I was becoming Catholic who were in RCIA programs in other cities, other places, and they were having horrific experiences.
Oh wow.
Just horrible experiences. We thankfully had quite the opposite, and on top of that, I was able to, through a series of events, our sponsors, Deacon Jack Loves and his wife Lorene. Deacon Jack was at that point getting his master's in theological studies through this program through the University of Dallas, which was actually a distance program where you actually had professors like Father Mitch Pacwa, um, Marcellino D'Ambrosio, and other great people who would come in and actually lecture. It was 18 hours each weekend, once a month for a weekend over 3 years. And what was great about that is that one of my professors early on was Mark Brumley, who's now the president of Ignatius Press. And through that connection, I eventually published my first book, Will Catholics Be Left Behind, which is really a critique of this eschatological system of thought that's very, very prevalent in various forms of, especially American fundamentalism and some evangelicalism.
Yeah,
Uh,
I should have
left,
led with
the left,
I
the
should have led
left
with the
behind
fact.
series.
Sorry, you go.
Yeah.
I just said I should have led with the fact that you were a best-selling author too. That's awesome.
Yeah, and so I was really fortunate to do that. And then basically what happened is I ended up working for 2 years as editor of Envoy magazine with Patrick Madrid, 2002, 2004. And then I took a job with Ignatius Press, who I've been with ever since. And initially I was doing a website called Ignatius Insight, where we were focusing on interviews with authors and so forth. And of course, we promoted a lot of Chesterton because Ignatius Press has published a lot of Chesterton books and been working on the collected works. I think there was a big push, and I'm not sure where it's at now, but and I don't even know how many volumes there are. It's close. I want to say it's close to 40. I probably shouldn't be trying to guess that.
It's something like that, though. Yeah, yeah.
But I have, most of those. And those were that set. Even as I was reading my way into the Catholic Church, so to speak, I was reading a lot of those Ignatius Press, volumes. So it was kind of a remarkable thing where I eventually began to work and then published books with Ignatius Press. So very, very fortunate to be able to do that, and it's been really wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're gonna do a push to sell those collected works, and maybe do a giveaway because they're really solid. I know. Chesterton was a master essayist. I mean, if his books are really good, Orthodoxy brings people in, but his essays are so meaty and they're like the perfect length to make up a point, and it's just great. I mean, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, well, when I tell people who've never read Chesterton, I say, well, get certainly look at Orthodoxy, but what I recommend right off the bat is get a collection of his essays, because what you're going to find is he writes about everything.
Yep.
It's something about the weather. It'll be something about just everything. Political.
Yeah, and it's some people have a hard time with his books because he is all over the place. Well, in an essay, since they're shorter, his essays, as a whole, are all over the place, but his essays are pretty succinct. One essay is pretty succinct, and you can grasp onto that. So, some people I know, and I'm sure you've encountered this too, kind of struggle with his style. I always liked it. I was reading a lot of Charles Dickens when I was younger, so I think that probably helped, having a little bit of that, because there's a little bit of I think. Well, Chesterton was influential in bringing Charles Dickens back.
Yeah, he was a huge. He was almost single-handedly responsible for kind of quote unquote rehabilitating Dickens, who had been kind of ignored, just like Chesterton. There's kind of interesting parallels there, how they both became ignored for a while.
Mm-hmm. I had to bring him back. Yeah,
rediscovered. Yeah, brought back, because just you can't keep greatness down. Obviously, Dickens is a very different writer in many ways, obviously, than Chesterton, but there's clearly an influence.
Mm-hmm.
In Chesterton, some people don't realize that Chesterton, a lot of his early works were literary criticism. Robert Louis Stevenson and Dickens, and I think you wrote a book on Chaucer too, right?
Yeah, I'm not the Alquist to ask, unfortunately.
He wrote on a really surprising range of, not surprising. He was obviously, Chesterton. Let's say this for him: Chesterton did not waste his time on social media. He just
It's kind of funny because Dickens would write chapter by chapter, right? Because one chapter at a time would be serialized, yeah, and so I don't think he'd have the whole thing written. He'd write a chapter at a time. I'm pretty sure that's what I heard. And so that's kind of Chestertonian, where he has to figure out where he's going to go as part of it is already created. And it's kind of funny. Yeah.
And Chesterton, from what I recall too, he would oftentimes be dictating a couple different things at once to a secretary.
Yep. He'd be writing and then dictating.
Yeah. And of course that brings up shades of St. Thomas Aquinas, who did the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
Two or three scribes going at once. We could just ponder that and wonder what that would be like, right?
I know. Well, that's really cool. So I had one more thing, unless you wanted to talk more about your experience in the editing world.
Well, no, I just would say that, Chesterton, when I became Catholic, my wife took as her patron Saint Teresa of Avila, and I took St. Thomas Aquinas. And part of that certainly was reading Aquinas, but part of that was reading Chesterton's book on Aquinas. That was so there's so many threads in my life going back that have a Chesterton quality to them, that were influenced by him. So I would just emphasize my great debt to him in so many ways. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah.
I know what the last question is about, right?
Yep.
We're going to criticize Chester. I'm going to criticize Chester.
Yeah. It's a little bit off topic, but we're discussing what to talk about with the podcast. You mentioned that you like jazz, which is cool.
Love jazz.
And Chesterton did not like jazz. Is that I recall hearing that from my dad, who.
Well, here I'll give you. This is from this is actually a book of quotations. He refers to jazz as the nightmare of noise. So I think right there we get a sense of where he's coming
Okay,
from.
that's
The
pretty
horn,
explicit. Wow.
the horns of hell rather than the horns of Elfland. Um,
All right, so that
he
now we know what Chesterton thinks about jazz.
talks about the battering monotony, and then this is a really funny line. Um, and without professing to know much about music, okay, that's a good qualifier. He says, I have formed a very strong impression about jazz. So Chesterton didn't like jazz. Now, Chesterton lived, he died in 1936. And so I don't know, of course, specifically what pieces of jazz he was listening to. Obviously, it was early jazz, probably New Orleans type jazz or whatever. What the interesting thing is that's not really my favorite kind of jazz either. I was at a conference a few years ago, and there was a guy about my same age, and we started talking about music, and we discovered we both love jazz. And he said, "Oh, I love everything up to about 1950." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting because I like everything after 1950." So part of my point there is that there's a lot of different aspects of jazz. There's a lot of different types of jazz. My guess, is that Chesterton, heard various forms of it. It was probably very jarring to his English sensibilities. Obviously, he was very much kind of a romantic. I'm using that term kind of qualitatively.
Sure, yeah.
In a certain way, qualified way, because he would certainly critique some of the romantics. But he loved his poem to be rhyming. He liked traditional poetry. I think he liked traditional music. He liked traditional kind of folk music or classical music, and I can appreciate that. I think though it's interesting because he talks another place about how with jazz there was this emphasis on slavery. There was too much of this kind of doom and gloom. I think he misses where jazz came out of, which of course is a uniquely Black experience, African American experience that was very much shaped by direct or indirect living of slavery. The blues obviously come out of the same thing. Jazz and blues have a very strong relationship. And I would actually go contrary with Chesterton and say, actually, when you really begin to listen to a lot of jazz, a wide range of jazz, what comes through, ironically, I think, is a great joyfulness.
Yeah, joy.
And a great sense of earthiness. And we shouldn't forget, that when we think of Scripture, how much of Scripture has to do with slavery, right? Liberation. What is the great event in the history of the people of Israel before the incarnation? Well, it's the Exodus, liberation from Egypt. So then you read so much of the Old Testament and even the New Testament, so much about slavery, being freed from slavery, being liberated from sin, etc. So I don't like all kinds of jazz. I mean, you get into like free jazz, and it's like, okay, I can't do that. Other kinds, but when I try to explain jazz to people, and this is where I would make, if Chesterton were sitting here, I would say to him, listen, I think you would love jazz if you understood it as being very traditional and also very individual, very collective at the same time. Jazz has a great history of having great standards, a great respect for tradition, in which the soloists, the individual players, get to then converse with that tradition within the setting of a trio or a quintet or a big band or whatever it is. And that's one thing I love about jazz, that it reflects and admires and respects the tradition. But within that context, then the saxophone player, the pianist, whoever, is able then to converse with it, to solo, to have a conversation. And jazz is really conversation. That's what great jazz is. It's great conversation between players who recognize the common tradition they come from. Yeah. I think if Chesterton could have heard it that way, maybe he'd have a very different take. I suspect he heard it on the streets, or he heard it somewhere. He was in a restaurant. He talks one place about, I'm in a restaurant. I don't want to listen to a bunch of loud music. I totally get that. I hate going into a bookstore and listening to classic 80s rock.
Yeah, or every store.
What's up with that, right?
Yeah.
So even though I like a lot of classic 80s rock. So I think context, and your dad and I had a fun conversation about this as well. So
yeah, I like that answer. And I agree for the most part. Have you seen the movie Whiplash, by the way?
I've not, no.
Oh, that's a good movie. That's one of my top 5s, I think. It's a very, it made me actually like and like sit down and start listening to jazz. Before that, I never really did that. But Whiplash is a very, ironic movie because it juxtaposes jazz. It's a very sad situation about this guy who wants to be the best jazz artist, and it's very atypical. And so there's a lot of sadness, but they're playing these upbeat jazz songs in an orchestra. And so it's a very, very well made movie. Like every scene is very, very solid. But so this is what I don't like, and I think it's a misrepresentation of jazz. I think it's the movies taking jazz out of context when there's always a scene when someone doesn't like jazz. It's kind of funny because the person doesn't like jazz, and then the musician comes and says, well, no, experience it, and then just play something, just play anything, and just improvise, and then all of a sudden the person can play it, and then it works together. But there, it's trying to say that anyone can do it at any point, like even if they have no understanding of jazz or never even heard it before. And I think that takes it so disregards any technique. It disregards, it's the opposite of collective. It's divorcing it from these other things. So I think you'd agree that like that's not usually what jazz is it?
No, right. And the thing about jazz, especially from about the end of World War I up through the late 40s, is that it was America's popular music. And it was interesting because it was dance music. People now, for better or for worse, obviously there's forms of dance that are, maybe go too far, and other forms of jazz that are much more agreeable. But setting kind of a morality aspect of aside, jazz was really where people got together and they danced, and there was very much a community aspect to jazz. And then you had with Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, et cetera, you had kind of a revolution within jazz where the focus became more small groups. There became more of an intellectual quality to it. Go back to the guy I talked with who likes the jazz up to that point. I like the jazz after, but the thing that still remains the same is, again, the group community aspect within which the individual knows his place. I mean, I wouldn't want to get too carried away with the analogy, but I think that there's something there that speaks to the truth of human condition, and even maybe the church herself, in that we have the common tradition, we have the truth of that, but we in our own way can express what we believe, the Catholic faith, but we always have to be mindful of the tradition and mindful of the different things that have gone before us. I think really great jazz doesn't try to destroy tradition at all. It actually builds on it. And there's a authentic development of doctrine, if I can apply that to it. So, I wouldn't want to take that too far, but I think it does speak to the truth of human nature. And by the way, I love classical music too. I listen to a lot of classical music as well.
Yeah, I also want to say something that that I want to push back against people who criticize jazz, like the people who are very much for classical music, and I am for classical music. I'm a classical pianist. Okay. But then there are people who really just like the rigid, like just go by the score, play the piece how it's quote unquote supposed to be played. Well, that's actually not even in the spirit of the classical music and the Baroque music written in the first place. In the past, you'd go back, or they would play the piece, and there was expected moments of improvisation. That was an expected part of it. But nowadays, what's there on the score is dogma, and you can't touch it. You have to play exactly what's on the sheet. But at least jazz has maintained some of this improvisation aspect, and there's room there for it. So that's really cool, I think.
Yeah, and jazz really is uniquely. I mean, obviously, jazz is all over the world now. I mean, you got great jazz coming out of all different places all over the world. I mean, I listen to jazz from Poland and a lot of stuff from England and so forth. But it's quintessentially American because the blues inform it so deeply. Even if some of it gets to the point where you can only catch some of it, that's underneath it. It's there as foundational. But it's been described as America's classical music, and I think there's really, you look at somebody like a Wynton Marsalis, who is an incredible jazz trumpet player and writer, and then he won a Grammy for his performing a variety of classical trumpet concertos, which are fantastic. So there's really a close relationship between jazz and classical, even if it's not always
Yeah.
immediately obvious.
No,
And
I agree. I totally agree.
you see it with like Chick Corea and Keith Jarrett and a lot of pianists. Brad Meldow is one of my favorites. I've seen him in concert a couple of times. He came out with speaking of what you're talking about, he came out with a album a couple years ago where he performs pieces by Bach, and then he does improvisational, things off of that. And I think it speaks to the liveliness, the fact that the music is it's not dead. It's very much alive. And again, I come back to the term conversation. It's about conversation, right? Mm-hmm. That's the same thing like with the Communion of Saints and reading Chesterton. To me, it's about a conversation. When you read a book, you're taking part of in a conversation.
Yeah, I agree. That's really cool. Cool. Well, I don't want to say that I'll have my dad on to disagree with that. Maybe I just won't tell him about this.
Now, your dad doesn't really like jazz, though, right? Is he?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Is if he hears this or listens to it, he might want to have a retort. I don't know. Maybe he doesn't feel that strongly. I forgot where he stands, but right. But I like that explanation and that answer. Yeah, cool. Well, that's all I have at this. We should have you on again, definitely.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to say? I'll plug your stuff in the description.
I just say that, one thing about Chesterton is that we've had a men's reading group here in Eugene, Oregon for a number of years now. We've read some Chesterton. It's always great when you get guys who've not really read him before, who then really interact with his writing and to get their responses. And of course, they're always like, oh, my favorite quotes, because he's so quotable. And they're oftentimes these paradoxes. So I think he just had that gift of getting to the heart of things in a way that's kind of disarming. And so I think cool. He makes it look so easy that until you try it yourself, you don't realize how absolutely genius it is. It's very difficult to do, and then to do it with the kind of prolific quality that he did was remarkable. So incredible man, incredible writer and thinker.
I know, it's great, and I encourage the listeners who haven't read a lot of Chesterton or any Chesterton to pick up some of the books through our shop. You can pick up My Name is Lazarus, which obviously isn't written by Chesterton, but it has Carl Olson's story. But yeah, if not that, pick up a book by Chesterton. Orthodoxy is a great place to start, of course. But yeah, thank you, Carl, for coming on today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks so much. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Until next time, help us to make uncommon sense more common.